Cedar Falls, Iowa, October 14th, 1978. The neon sign of Murphy's Diner buzzed and flickered against the autumn evening, casting pink and blue shadows across the empty parking lot. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the lingering aroma of apple pie, while Patsy Cline's voice drifted from the old jukebox in the corner. It was just past 9 p.m. when Linda Marie Sullivan tied her apron strings one final time. At 23, Linda had been working at Murphy's for nearly 4 years, ever since she'd graduated from Cedar Falls High School. Her blonde hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she had a way of remembering every customer's usual order. The regulars loved her warm smile, and the way she'd ask about their families while refilling their coffee cups. "You heading out soon, Linda?" called Frank Murphy from behind the counter, wiping down the old cash register with a worn dish rag. Frank had owned the diner for 15 years and treated his employees like family. "Just finishing up table 6, Linda replied, balancing a tray of dirty dishes on her hip. The autumn air outside was crisp, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as customers came and went through the glass door. That evening, only 3 customers remained. Old Mr. Henderson nursing his usual black coffee and reading the Cedar Falls Gazette, a young couple sharing a slice of chocolate cake, and a stranger in a dark coat who'd ordered nothing but coffee and sat quietly in the back booth. Linda had noticed the stranger earlier. He'd been there for over an hour, occasionally glancing up from his newspaper but mostly keeping to himself. She'd refilled his cup twice, and both times he'd nodded politely but said nothing beyond "thank you." There was something about his presence that made her feel slightly uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Linda, you can clock out," Frank said, counting the day's receipts. "I'll handle the last few customers." She untied her apron and hung it on the hook beside the kitchen door. Her 1973 Chevrolet Nova was parked just outside the blue paint slightly faded but the engine still reliable. Linda had been saving money for college, hoping to study nursing at the University of Northern Iowa. She kept her savings in a coffee can hidden in her bedroom closet, adding to it with every paycheck. As she gathered her purse and light jacket, Linda waved goodbye to Frank and stepped out into the cool October air. The street lamps had just flickered on, and the sound of distant traffic hummed through the quiet downtown area. She walked to her car, fishing for her keys in her purse. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for Frank's pickup truck and Mr. Henderson's old Ford. Linda didn't notice the dark sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the way its engine started just as she unlocked her car door. She drove the familiar route home to her small apartment on Elm Street, passing the Cedar Falls Community Center, where she volunteered on weekends, and the small park where she sometimes fed the ducks during her lunch breaks. The radio played softly, a song by Fleetwood Mac that she hummed along to. Linda lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment above Peterson's hardware store. Her landlord, Mr. Peterson, was a kind man in his 60s who often brought her homemade cookies and checked on her like a father would. She had moved there after saving enough money to live independently, proud of her ability to support herself. That night, she followed her usual routine: a warm bath, a cup of chamomile tea, and a few pages of the romance novel she kept on her nightstand. She had plans for the weekend: lunch with her sister Karen, who lived 2 towns over, and perhaps a trip to the farmer's market to buy fresh apples for the pie she'd promised to bring to Sunday dinner at her parents' house. Linda set her alarm for 7 a.m., planning to be at Murphy's by 8 for the breakfast rush. She turned off the bedside lamp and settled into bed, unaware that by morning her absence would set in motion a mystery that would haunt Cedar Falls for decades to come. The last person to see Linda Marie Sullivan was Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an elderly neighbor who lived across the hall. Mrs. Chen heard Linda's footsteps on the stairs around 10:30 p.m. and saw a brief sliver of light under Linda's door before it went dark around 11 p.m. After that, there was only silence. Cedar Falls, Iowa, October 15th, 1978. Frank Murphy unlocked the diner's front door at 6 a.m. sharp, just as he had every morning for 15 years. The October morning was cold, with frost covering the windows of the parked cars along Main Street. He turned on the coffee makers, fired up the grill, and waited for his morning crew to arrive. By 8:15 a.m., Frank began to worry. Linda had never been late without calling, not once in her 4 years of working at Murphy's. She was reliable as clockwork, often arriving early to help set up for the breakfast rush. He tried calling her apartment, but the phone rang endlessly with no answer. "Maybe she's sick," suggested Betty Martinez, the other morning waitress, as she tied her apron and began setting up tables. "You know how that flu's been going around." But Frank knew Linda would have called. She was responsible, considerate, the kind of employee who would drag herself to work with a fever, before leaving them short-handed during the busy breakfast rush. At noon, when Linda still hadn't shown up or called, Frank drove to her apartment building. He knocked on her door repeatedly, calling her name. Mr. Peterson, the landlord, heard the commotion and came upstairs with his spare key. "She's probably just sleeping heavy," Mr. Peterson said, though his voice carried a note of concern. "She's been working extra shifts lately." They opened the door to find Linda's apartment exactly as she'd left it. Her bed was made, her breakfast dishes washed and put away. Her purse was gone, but her car keys sat on the kitchen counter next to an empty coffee cup. Most unsettling of all, her 1973 Chevrolet Nova was missing from its usual parking spot behind the building. Frank immediately called the Cedar Falls Police Department. Officer Jim Bradley arrived within 20 minutes, a tall man in his 40s who had been with the force for over a decade. He took notes carefully, examining Linda's apartment with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the first hours of a missing person case were crucial. "Any boyfriends? Family disputes? Money troubles?" Officer Bradley asked as he walked through the small apartment. "Nothing like that," Frank replied, shaking his head. Linda was saving for college. She was close with her family, especially her sister Karen, never mentioned any problems with anyone. Linda's parents, Robert and Margaret Sullivan, arrived from their farm outside town within the hour. Margaret's eyes were red from crying, while Robert's jaw was set in the determined way of a man trying to hold his family together. They had raised Linda and her sister Karen with strong values, and the family remained close even after both daughters had moved out. "She was supposed to come for Sunday dinner," Margaret whispered, clutching a tissue. "She promised to bring her apple pie. Linda never breaks her promises." The initial police investigation revealed few clues. Linda's savings, nearly $800 she'd been accumulating for college, were missing from the coffee can in her closet. Her suitcase was gone, along with some of her clothes. To many, including some of the police officers, it looked like Linda had simply decided to start a new life somewhere else. "Young people do that sometimes," Officer Bradley told the family, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "They get restless, want to see what's out there beyond small-town life." But Linda's family and friends knew better. Karen Sullivan, Linda's younger sister, drove in from Des Moines every weekend to help with the search efforts. She organized volunteers, distributed flyers, and refused to accept the theory that Linda had simply run away. "My sister would never just leave without saying goodbye," Karen insisted to anyone who would listen. She was excited about starting college. She had plans, dreams. She wouldn't abandon everything. The search efforts were extensive but yielded nothing concrete. Volunteers combed the countryside around Cedar Falls, checked abandoned buildings, and questioned anyone who might have seen Linda or her blue Nova. The Iowa State Patrol issued a statewide bulletin, and Linda's photograph appeared in newspapers across the Midwest. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The initial surge of community support gradually faded as people returned to their daily routines. Frank kept Linda's job open for 3 months before finally hiring a replacement, though he never stopped hoping she would walk through the diner's door with that familiar smile. By Christmas of 1978, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. Linda Marie Sullivan had become another statistic, a young woman who had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the fading hope of a family that refused to stop believing she would come home. The case files gathered dust in the Cedar Falls Police Department, and Linda's missing person poster was eventually replaced by newer cases. But in the hearts of those who knew her, Linda Sullivan remained as real and present as ever, frozen in time as the 23-year-old waitress who had simply never come home from her last shift at Murphy's Diner, Cedar Falls, Iowa, September 22nd, 1995. 17 years had passed since Linda Sullivan's disappearance, and Cedar Falls had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Murphy's Diner had closed in 1987 when Frank Murphy retired, the building now housing a small insurance office. The downtown area had seen several businesses come and go, and many of the families who had searched for Linda had moved away or passed on. Robert and Margaret Sullivan had aged considerably, the years of uncertainty etching deep lines around their eyes. They still lived on their farm outside town, though Robert's arthritis had forced him to lease most of his land to neighboring farmers. Karen Sullivan, now Karen Mitchell, had married and moved to Chicago, but still called her parents every Sunday. And the conversation inevitably turned to Linda. It was Tommy Kowalski, a 17-year-old high school student, who made the discovery that would change everything. Tommy was exploring the abandoned Hartwell grain elevator on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, a massive concrete structure that had been shuttered since the mid-1980s when the farming cooperative went bankrupt. The grain elevator sat on a forgotten stretch of land near the old railroad tracks, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted equipment. Local teenagers occasionally used it as a hangout spot, despite the no trespassing signs and the building's reputation for being unsafe. Tommy had climbed to the third level of the structure, following a dare from his friends to retrieve a baseball that had been thrown up there weeks earlier. He was using his flashlight to search through the debris when the beam illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Partially hidden beneath a pile of old grain sacks and covered by 17 years of dust was a woman's purse. The leather was cracked and faded, but the brass clasp still bore the initials LMS. Inside, Tommy found a driver's license issued to Linda Marie Sullivan, along with $43 in cash, a lipstick tube, and a small appointment book with entries from October 1978. But it was what he found next that would prove most significant. Linda's car keys, attached to a small keychain shaped like a coffee cup, a gift from her co-workers at Murphy's Diner. And tucked behind the cash was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, containing a handwritten note in Linda's careful script. "If something happens to me, check the old Morrison place on County Road 47. He said he knew my routine. I'm scared, but I don't know who to trust. LMS." October 14th, 1978. Tommy immediately called the police from the nearest farmhouse. The current police chief, Maria Rodriguez, had only heard stories about the Linda Sullivan case from older officers, but she recognized the significance of the discovery immediately. The grain elevator was sealed as a crime scene, and within hours, investigators were carefully documenting every detail of the third-floor storage area. The note changed everything. The Morrison place on County Road 47 had been an abandoned farmhouse even in 1978, sitting on 20 acres of overgrown land about 15 miles outside Cedar Falls. The property had changed hands several times over the years, and in 1995 it belonged to a development company planning to build a small subdivision. Margaret Sullivan was in her garden when Chief Rodriguez arrived at the farmhouse that September afternoon. She listened in stunned silence as the chief explained what had been found, her weathered hands gripping the kitchen table as she absorbed the news. "She left us a message," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After all these years, she was trying to tell us what happened." Robert Sullivan sat heavily in his chair, staring at the photocopy of Linda's note. "County Road 47, he murmured. "We searched that area back in 78, searched it 3 times. But we never thought to look inside the buildings." The discovery at the grain elevator made front-page news in the Cedar Falls Gazette and was picked up by newspapers across Iowa. Suddenly, Linda Sullivan's name was back in the public consciousness, and the police department was flooded with tips and theories from people who remembered the case. Karen Mitchell drove from Chicago the moment she heard the news, arriving at her parents' farm with her own 15-year-old daughter in tow. Standing in her childhood bedroom, now used as her mother's sewing room, Karen held Linda's purse and felt the weight of 17 years of wondering. "She tried to leave us clues," Karen said to her mother. "She knew something was wrong, and she tried to protect herself." Chief Rodriguez assembled a team to investigate the Morrison property, bringing in specialists from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The note suggested that Linda had been fearful of someone who knew her routine, information that cast her disappearance in an entirely different light. As the sun set over Cedar Falls on September 22, 1995, the Sullivan family felt something they hadn't experienced in 17 years. Hope mixed with dread. Linda's purse had been found, and with it, a message from beyond the silence. But the note also confirmed their worst fears, that Linda hadn't run away to start a new life, but had instead fallen victim to someone who had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The old Morrison place on County Road 47 would be searched at dawn, and with it, the possibility that Linda Sullivan's 17-year-old mystery was finally about to be solved. Cedar Falls, Iowa, September 23, 1995. The Morrison farmhouse stood like a weathered sentinel against the grey morning sky, its windows boarded up and its front porch sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Chief Rodriguez arrived at sunrise with a team of investigators, including Detective Sarah Walsh from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and 2 officers with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The property stretched across 20 acres of overgrown fields and scattered outbuildings. A rusted barn sat about 100 yards from the main house, its roof partially collapsed. An old well, covered by rotting wooden planks, was hidden among the tall grass near what had once been a vegetable garden. Detective Walsh, a seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience in cold cases, coordinated the search methodically. The team would examine every structure on the property, paying particular attention to areas where the ground appeared to have been disturbed in the late 1970s. "We're looking for anything unusual," Walsh explained to the team. "Find concrete pours that don't match the original construction, areas where vegetation grows differently, any signs of excavation from that time period." By mid-morning, the ground-penetrating radar had identified 3 anomalies on the property. 2 were quickly ruled out: an old septic tank behind the house and a cluster of buried farm equipment near the barn. But the 3rd anomaly, located beneath the floor of a small storage shed behind the main house, would prove significant. The shed was barely 8 feet square, constructed of rough lumber and corrugated metal roofing. Inside, investigators found the concrete floor had been poured in 2 distinct sections. The main floor appeared original to the building's construction in the 1940s, but a smaller section near the back wall showed signs of being much newer. "This concrete is different," Detective Walsh observed, crouching down to examine the junction between the old and new sections. "Different aggregate, different color. I'd estimate this was poured sometime in the late 1970s. As investigators prepared to break through the newer concrete, Chief Rodriguez received a phone call that would crack the case wide open. An elderly woman named Dorothy Hartwell, former owner of the grain elevator where Linda's purse had been found, had seen the news coverage and wanted to speak with police. Mrs. Hartwell, now 81 and living in a Cedar Falls nursing home, had a clear memory despite her advanced age. She remembered a man who had worked at the grain elevator during the late 1970s, someone who had access to the building and often worked alone during evening shifts. "His name was Vernon Pike," Mrs. Hartwell told Chief Rodriguez over the phone. "He was our night security guard and part-time maintenance worker, quiet fellow, kept to himself mostly. But he got fired in November of 1978 for coming to work drunk and bothering some of the female employees during day shifts." Pike's name didn't immediately ring bells with the investigators, but a records check revealed he had been questioned briefly during the original investigation into Linda's disappearance. At the time, he had provided an alibi and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Meanwhile, at the Morrison property, investigators had broken through the newer concrete in the storage shed. Beneath it, they found a metal footlocker wrapped in plastic sheeting. Inside the footlocker were Linda's missing clothes, her suitcase, and most significantly, a spiral notebook containing detailed observations of Linda's daily routine. The notebook, written in a cramped, methodical handwriting, documented Linda's schedule with disturbing precision. It noted what time she arrived at work, when she took her breaks, which route she drove home, and even what she typically ordered for lunch. The entries dated back to August 1978 and continued right up until October 14th, the day Linda disappeared. "She was being stalked," Detective Walsh said grimly, flipping through the notebook's pages. "Whoever wrote this had been watching her for months." A handwriting analysis would later confirm that the notebook had been written by Vernon Pike, but it was the final entry, dated October 14th, 1978, that provided the most chilling details. L. Stays late on Saturday nights, usually leaves around 9:30. Drives home alone. Car parked behind building, dark area. Good opportunity. She won't cause trouble if approached right way. Plan, wait in parking lot. Follow her home. Tell her car trouble. Need help. She's too nice to say no. The investigation into Vernon Pike revealed a man with a history of boundary violations and an unhealthy obsession with young women. Born in 1943, Pike had moved to Cedar Falls in 1977 after losing a job in Des Moines under circumstances that weren't entirely clear. He lived alone in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of town and had few friends or social connections. Pike had left Cedar Falls abruptly in December 1978, just 2 months after Linda's disappearance. According to former co-workers, he had claimed he was moving to Oregon to live with relatives, but no forwarding address was ever provided. A nationwide search for Vernon Pike began immediately. Detective Walsh coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country, but the trail had gone cold decades earlier. Pike had effectively vanished, just as Linda had, leaving behind only the evidence of his calculated crime. It was Pike's former neighbor, Ralph Hendricks, who provided the final piece of the puzzle. Hendricks, now in his 70s, remembered Pike asking to borrow his pickup truck on the night of October 14, 1978, claiming his own vehicle wouldn't start. He brought it back the next morning, real early, Hendricks recalled. Truck was muddy, and he'd put a lot of miles on it. When I asked him about it, he just said he'd had to drive to Des Moines for a family emergency, but Pike never mentioned having family anywhere. The physical evidence found at the Morrison property, combined with the notebook's detailed stalking records, painted a clear picture of what had happened to Linda Sullivan. Vernon Pike had followed her home that October night, confronted her at her apartment building, and somehow convinced or forced her to leave with him. The missing money and clothes had been taken to make it appear that Linda had run away voluntarily. As for Linda herself, her fate remained a mystery. Despite extensive searches of the Morrison property and surrounding areas, no trace of her was found. Pike had been methodical in planning her abduction, and it appeared he had been equally methodical in covering his tracks. The case against Vernon Pike was solid, but the man himself remained missing. In December 1995, Cedar Falls police issued a federal warrant for Pike's arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder, but 17 years had passed, and Pike could be anywhere or nowhere. Cedar Falls, Iowa, March 15, 1996. The call came on a cold Friday morning when frost still covered the windows of the Sullivan farmhouse. Chief Rodriguez's voice was steady, but carried the weight of long-awaited news. Vernon Pike had been found. He wasn't hiding in some distant city or living under an assumed name. Vernon Pike was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Portland, Oregon, where he had died of a heart attack in February 1983, more than 4 years after Linda's disappearance. He had been living under his real name, working as a janitor at a Portland office building, and had died alone in his small apartment at the age of 39. Margaret Sullivan set down the phone receiver with trembling hands. After 18 years of wondering, hoping, and fearing, they finally had answers. But those answers came with a bitter realization. Vernon Pike had taken Linda's secrets to his grave. Detective Walsh traveled to Portland to investigate Pike's life during his final years. She found a man who had lived in isolation, working menial jobs and avoiding social contact. His landlords remembered him as quiet and reliable with rent payments, but peculiar and unfriendly. He had no known friends or romantic relationships and seemed to have deliberately severed all ties with his past in Iowa. Among Pike's possessions, found in a storage unit he had rented since 1979, Portland police discovered more evidence of his obsessive nature. There were photographs of other young women, apparently taken without their knowledge, and detailed notes about their routines. Most unsettling was a collection of newspaper clippings about Linda Sullivan's disappearance, carefully preserved in a manila folder. One item stood out among Pike's belongings: a small coffee cup keychain identical to the one Linda had carried. It was a cruel trophy that confirmed what everyone already knew. Vernon Pike had been responsible for Linda's disappearance and almost certainly her death. The discovery of Pike's death brought a strange mix of relief and frustration to Cedar Falls. The community finally had answers about who had taken Linda Sullivan, but Pike's death meant there would never be a trial, never a chance for him to reveal what he had done with Linda's body, or why he had chosen her as his victim. "At least we know," Robert Sullivan said quietly, standing in his kitchen where he had answered countless phone calls about his missing daughter over the years. "It's not the ending we wanted, but at least we know she didn't choose to leave us." The revelation about Pike prompted other women to come forward with stories about uncomfortable encounters they had experienced in Cedar Falls during the late 1970s. Sarah Jenkins, now a grandmother living in Iowa City, remembered a man who had followed her home from the library several times in 1978, always staying just far enough back to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough to be unsettling. "I remember telling my roommate about it," Sarah recalled, "but when I reported it to the police, they said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually approached me or threatened me." Looking back, I think it might have been the same man. Linda's case became a catalyst for changes in how Cedar Falls police handled stalking reports and missing person cases. Chief Rodriguez implemented new protocols requiring more thorough investigation, of anyone reported to be following or watching others, regardless of whether threats had been made explicitly. In June 1996, the community held a memorial service for Linda Sullivan at the Cedar Falls Community Center, where she had volunteered on weekends. Over 200 people attended, including former co-workers from Murphy's Diner, high school classmates, and families who had participated in the original search efforts. Karen Mitchell spoke at the service, her voice strong despite her tears. "My sister Linda was kind to everyone she met. She remembered your coffee order, asked about your children, and always had a smile ready. Vernon Pike may have taken her from us, but he could never take away the impact she had on this community." Frank Murphy, now in his 70s and using a walker, attended the service with his wife. "Linda was the best employee I ever had," he said simply. "More than that, she was like a daughter to me. I'm glad we finally know what happened, even if it's not the ending any of us wanted." The memorial service included the dedication of a small garden behind the community center, planted with Linda's favorite flowers, daffodils and tulips that would bloom each spring. A granite bench was placed among the flowers, engraved with a simple message: "Linda Marie Sullivan, 1955 to 1978, remembered with love." Margaret Sullivan lived to see the memorial garden's first spring bloom, passing away peacefully in her sleep in April 1997. Robert followed her 2 years later, finally reunited with the wife who had stood by him through the darkest period of their lives. They were buried in the Cedar Falls Cemetery, their headstone bearing an inscription that had provided them comfort during the long years of uncertainty. "Until we meet again." Today, Linda Sullivan's case is studied in criminal justice courses as an example of how cold cases can be solved through persistent investigation and community support. Her story has been featured in several true crime documentaries, always with the permission of her family, and always with the message that Linda was more than just a victim. She was a beloved daughter, sister, and friend whose life had meaning far beyond the circumstances of her death. The old Morrison property was eventually developed into a small subdivision called Sullivan Springs, with street names honoring Linda's memory. The grain elevator where her purse was found was demolished in 1998, but not before a final search revealed Linda's 1973 Chevrolet Nova buried beneath years of debris in the building's basement level. The car provided additional forensic evidence linking Vernon Pike to the crime, though by then the case had already been officially closed. Vernon Pike's grave in Portland remains unmarked and unvisited. In contrast, Linda Sullivan's memorial garden in Cedar Falls continues to bloom each spring, tended by volunteers who never knew her personally but understand the importance of remembering those who are taken too soon. The case of Linda Marie Sullivan reminds us that behind every missing person report is a family waiting for answers, a community forever changed, and a life that mattered to those who knew it. Sometimes justice comes too late for the living to witness, but it comes nonetheless, carried forward by those who refuse to let the disappeared be forgotten. In the end, Linda Sullivan did come home to Cedar Falls, not in the way her family had hoped and prayed for 18 long years, but in the memories preserved by those who loved her, and in the changes her case brought to protect other young women from sharing her fate. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a testament to the power of community, persistence, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to have their story told.